Hello, dear students. This week we will continue to discuss the further development of the trade routes of the Silk Roads in the period we're studying, which I remind you is from around 630 CE after Christ, when Islam began to spread outside of Arabia, to around 1400. More specifically, we will be looking at how the further development of the Silk Roads in this period led to an intensification, commercial, cultural, and technological exchange across Afro-Eurasian civilizations. The first thing we need to do is to define more precisely what we mean by Silk Roads. To put it simply, we mean trade routes, roads along which trade was practiced. Goods were moved from place to place. Notice that I'm using the plural, not the singular. The Silk Roads with an S, not the Silk Road in the singular. And this is because there were many Silk Roads. Some ran overland across deserts, mountains, rivers, and plains, such as the most famous of the Silk Roads, connecting Xi'an over here in China, in Western China, with Central Asia and beyond, all the way to Byzantium, Rome, Venice, and then we saw last week, Western Africa and Western Europe. It's important to note also that other Silk Roads, as you also see in this map, were maritime. Maritime means they ran on water. In other words, their trade was conducted aboard boats across the Indian Ocean, connecting Indonesia with Arabia, India, and ultimately Italy and Africa. The main direction of trade was from east to west, because at the time, the Far East, China and India, produced most of the luxury goods, the expensive goods, that Westerners, Western Europeans, but also increasingly West Africans at the other end of Afro-Eurasia wanted. Luxury goods such as silk, cotton, textiles, and porcelain. So those luxury goods went from east to west, and they're the most expensive and valued of the goods of the Silk Roads. However, some goods also flowed from west to east, such as leather, horses, and silver. As we saw last week, much of this trade in this period was conducted by Arab and Muslim merchants that dominated the central part of Afro-Eurasia here, and therefore dominated also its trade and profited as middlemen enormously from that trade, explaining in part why Islam experienced a golden age. It was rich thanks to that business. But it's also important to note, going back to the Silk Roads, that the trade of the Silk Road also involved exchange between north and south. Okay, for example, the Chinese traded with their northern neighbors, the nomadic populations of the north, the warlike nomadic populations of the north, such as the Mongols, right? So we had north and south trade, east and west, west and east trade in all directions, and trade, importantly, that was increasingly coming to cover really much of this area of Afro-Eurasia by the time period we're looking at. So the other point I want to make here is that most goods were actually traded locally, okay, locally in a given region here, like the one that I'm pointing out with my arrow here. It was actually only select luxury goods, such as silk, cotton, textiles, and porcelain, that actually made it all the way from one end of Eurasia, the eastern end, China, all the way to the other end, Western Europe and Western Africa. And these were goods that were worth a lot of money, such as cotton, textiles, and silk or porcelain, because of the high cost of transportation. It was only worth transporting an object from China to Europe if it was worth a lot, right? Because it costs a lot to transport it. Okay. However, this long distance exchange of luxury goods, though limited in quantity, again, most trade was local, though limited in quality, it does demonstrate, however, that the Afro-Eurasian world was becoming more and more and truly interconnected, and also more and more dependent on trade and exchange. Okay, importantly, such commercial or trade exchanges facilitated and encouraged also, this is a very important point I'm going to conclude the slide with here, trade or commerce encourage other kinds of exchange of ideas, of technologies, culture. Okay, we talked last week about how the Western Europe, adopted so-called Arabic numerals and Arabic mathematics in this period, thanks to these various exchanges. Okay, so the world of the Silk Roads, in other words, in this period, was becoming more like our own modern world. We really have, in some sense, we could say, have the beginning of some of the things we recognize as modern. Trade, exchange of ideas, populations moving from place to place, merchants traveling to exchange goods. Okay, so finally, I should note that Western Europe benefited enormously from the Silk Road, not only because of the luxury goods such as silk and porcelain it acquired at high cost from China or India, but even more so because of the technologies and know-how Western Europeans acquired from the more advanced and sophisticated East. Remember, what I've been telling you is that in this period, the Islamic East, the Chinese, the Indian East were more advanced. They were wealthier than the more Western parts of Afro-Eurasia. And so this process of exchange benefited greatly the Western extremity of Afro-Eurasia, particularly Western Europe, because Western Europeans learned a lot from Easterners, from Muslims, from Chinese, and from Indian technologies. Okay, just to give you one example among many of how Westerners benefited from the Easterners, it was Arab merchants, Muslim merchants from the East, who invented the money order or check that facilitates trade by allowing for easy transfers of money. In fact, our actual word check in English, it comes from a very similar Arabic word. I could cite hundreds of other examples illustrating how the Silk Roads led to a massive transfer of knowledge in this period, from the richer and more advanced East to less sophisticated and advanced parts of feudal Western Europe. Okay, we will see, though, within a couple of centuries after our period, after 1400, it will be Western Europe that will start to grow and become more powerful. Now, I want to conclude by briefly noting that this period of intensified trade was also one that witnessed more and more long-distance travel on the part of single individuals. Most famous was Marco Polo, an Italian from Venice, over here, who traveled all the way to China. But there were other such single travelers, growing numbers of long-distance travelers from all origins, as far-reaching travel was undertaken a century later by Ibn Battuta, a Muslim, actually, from what is now Morocco over here, who traveled like Marco Polo as far as China, but not only. He also traveled to the north, to Russia, and then as far south as the Horn of Africa and further down. So both Marco Polo and Ibn Battuta left us diaries of their travels, which were then published and stimulated readers' curiosity about far-flung places. Okay, so this is a period in which the world is opening up. People are traveling, people are trading increasingly. So to conclude, the world of the Silk Roads was a changing one of quickening trade, travel, exchange of ideas, technologies. And in this way, it is a distant world, but it is one that, however, announces the world we live in, a world interconnected by long distance travel and trade and an intense exchange of culture, technologies across diverse civilizations and across vast distances. Okay. Next week, we will see, however, that this increasing global interdependence, as we call it, was also one that would lead to the spread of disease. Okay, disease. This is something that's also familiar to us right now. All right, have a good week, and we will talk again soon.